When Rihanna first moved into the sprawling mansion in the Hollywood Hills, she was ecstatic. The house tucked among the hills, shrouded in the mystique of old Hollywood, seemed perfect for her. The elegant stonework and modern amenities made it a sanctuary for the superstar. But something about the place always felt off. It wasn't long before the rumors started to swirl. Neighbors claimed to hear strange sounds echoing from the mansion at odd hours, whispers, footsteps, a door creaking open when no one was there. A shadowy figure was said to be seen through the windows, pacing the halls. One evening, after returning from a late rehearsal, Rihanna was alone in the house when she first heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps coming from the upstairs hallway. She froze, certain it was a member of her team, but when she rushed upstairs, the house was eerily silent. The crew was gone, the doors locked, but the unmistakable echo of those footsteps lingered in the air. As days passed, the sounds grew more distinct. First, it was the sound of someone calling her name, soft and distant. "Nah," it whispered, as if drifting from the walls themselves. Then, objects began to move on their own. Her favorite perfume bottle knocked off the dresser. A glass shattered with no one around. The once warm home began to feel like a prison. Rihanna dismissed it at first. A sound. An old house. But then came the cold. A freezing chill settled in certain rooms at night, colder than any air conditioning could make it. Her bodyguard, Derek, confessed to her that he had seen the figure, a tall silhouette of a man, standing motionless in the corner of the living room, staring at the empty space with hollow eyes. Rihanna tried to ignore it, but after several sleepless nights, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. One night, desperate for answers, she sat alone in the dimly lit living room, waiting. She closed her eyes and listened. The silence was deafening. But then, it came, a low growl from behind her. Turning quickly, her breath caught in her throat. The curtains, which had been perfectly still moments before, fluttered violently. The temperature dropped so sharply she could see her own breath. Her skin crawled. Something or someone was in the room with her. The final straw came when Rihanna called in a priest, desperate for peace of mind. The priest, after conducting a blessing, admitted that the mansion had a history, an unsettling one. A previous owner, an actor named Robert Harris, had been found dead in the very same spot where the chill had often appeared. His death was ruled an overdose, but rumors whispered of foul play and unfinished business. Robert's spirit, the priest claimed, still lingered in the house, bound to it by an unresolved anger. Terrified, Rihanna decided to sell the mansion. The buyers who came afterward were equally unnerved, though they tried to ignore the whispers of the past. But when they moved in, the stories began again. Strange sounds, unseen eyes, a feeling that, no matter how luxurious the house, they were never truly alone. The mansion stands empty now, its once grand doors and windows boarded up. No one dares to stay for long. The air is thick with the past, and the footsteps in the hallway have yet to stop. The mansion sat empty for months after Rihanna left, its gates locked, its windows dark. But as the whispers of its haunted past continued to spread, curious buyers, thrill-seekers, and the occasional skeptic found their way to the property, hoping to uncover the truth behind the eerie stories. Most didn't last more than a few days. One such buyer was Blake Harris, an ambitious real estate mogul who saw the mansion as the perfect investment. He'd heard the rumors, of course, but he wasn't one to be frightened easily. With a quick renovation plan in mind, he moved in with a team of contractors. They began immediately, but it wasn't long before they started experiencing things that they couldn't explain. Blake would wake up at odd hours, as if someone was shaking him from his sleep. The feeling of cold fingers brushing against his neck was almost unbearable. His assistant, Lucy, started finding cryptic messages scrawled on the walls, written in a strange, shaky hand. "Leave before it's too late. I'm still here." The team brushed it off as a prank, but the unease only grew. It wasn't until Blake began experiencing the most unsettling thing of all voices that the true horror began. It started in the kitchen. One evening, he was standing alone, pouring a glass of water, when he heard it. A whisper in his ear, as though someone was just behind him. "You'll never leave." He spun around, but there was no one there. The air, however, felt thick with malice. The following night, he took his phone out to record. He wanted proof, something to explain away the oddities. He stood in the grand entryway, camera on, his breath shallow as he waited. It didn't take long. A shadow appeared in the hallway, moving against the dim light of the chandelier, yet no one was there. Blake's heart raced. He couldn't deny it any longer. Something was in the house with him. Lucy, too, felt it. Every time she entered the master bedroom, the temperature dropped, and she found herself short of breath, as if the walls were closing in around her. One morning, she stumbled upon something she couldn't explain, her reflection in the mirror, but distorted. Her face was pale, hollow, her eyes wide with terror, and she swore the reflection didn't match her movements. She fled the room, but it didn't matter. The house had already claimed her. Blake, now increasingly frantic, reached out to a paranormal investigator named Jason Doyle, a man known for his unorthodox methods and cold, logical approach to hauntings. Jason agreed to come to the mansion, dismissing the rumors as mere superstition at first. But as the hours passed, even his skepticism began to waver. The first thing Jason noticed was the oppressive silence. The house was too quiet, unnaturally still, as though the walls themselves were waiting. The second thing he discovered was a series of old photographs in a dusty chest hidden behind the master bedroom wall. The photos, sepia-toned and yellowing with age, depicted a family, a man, woman, and 2 children who appeared happy and normal. But something about the photos was wrong. The family members seemed too rigid, their smiles too perfect, their eyes too vacant. It wasn't until Jason sat down in front of the fireplace, attempting a séance, that he understood the true nature of the house's torment. He called out to the spirit of Robert Harris, demanding answers, demanding peace. The room grew colder, the temperature plummeting until Jason's breath fogged the air in front of him. Then, a voice, not just a whisper but a guttural growl, rang out from the shadows. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The lights flickered violently, the walls shook, and the entire house seemed to come alive with a horrible energy. Jason's equipment began malfunctioning, and the room felt as if it was closing in on him. He screamed for help, but the air had turned thick and oppressive. His voice was swallowed by the darkness. Suddenly, Blake heard it, the loudest crash, followed by Jason's frantic cries. He ran through the hallways, desperately searching for the investigator. When he found him, Jason was kneeling on the floor, his eyes wide with terror. His mouth moved, but no sound escaped. His fingers were trembling, pointing towards a dark corner of the room. Blake followed his gaze, but what he saw made his blood run cold. In the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the dim light, stood a figure. A tall, shadowy man, his face hidden in the darkness, but Blake could feel his eyes cold, empty, watching. The figure took a step forward, and the air grew heavy with the stench of decay. Blake froze. He couldn't move. Jason's final words before collapsing were burned into his mind. "It's not just Robert. They're all here." And that was the moment Blake realized. The house wasn't just haunted by one spirit. It was a place where the dead lingered, a collection of unfinished lives, trapped in the walls, waiting for anyone foolish enough to move in. No matter how many times it was sold, no matter who lived there, the mansion would never be free. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Blake tried to shake off the horrific vision he had witnessed. Jason was now unconscious, his body limp on the floor, but his eyes still wide open stared blankly at the shadow in the corner. Blake wanted to run, to get out of the house as fast as he could, but something held him in place. The figure, still hidden in the dark, had not moved. Instead, it seemed to be growing taller, somehow more solid, as if pulling itself from the very walls. A sudden, unnerving sound broke the silence, a soft creak, like a floorboard being stepped on. Blake whipped around, his heart pounding in his chest. The noise came from the hallway, from upstairs. He instinctively glanced at the stairs, the same staircase where Rihanna had once claimed to hear footsteps. But this time it wasn't just the sound of footsteps. It was a voice, faint but clear enough for Blake to hear. "You can't escape." Blake's legs buckled, and he stumbled back toward the entryway. But the house seemed to be closing in on him, the walls shifting, as if the very structure itself were alive and breathing. His mind raced, searching for an explanation, anything to make sense of the madness, but every logical thought slipped away as fear overtook him. He had to get out. He had to leave. But as he turned to flee, he found that the front door was no longer where it should have been. Instead of the wide, welcoming entrance he'd passed through hours earlier, the door now stood at the far end of a long, dimly lit corridor. And at the end of the corridor was the shadow, no longer just a faint outline in the dark, but now fully formed. A tall man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, his face obscured by darkness. The man stepped forward, and Blake could see just for a moment his eyes. Hollow, empty like two bottomless pits. The air around him seemed to warp, and Blake could feel the weight of the house pressing down on him, crushing the life out of him. "Leave now," the figure whispered, its voice deep, distorted, as though it came from another time, another place. "You are not welcome here." Blake's breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. The figure took another step forward, and in the dim light, Blake saw something he hadn't noticed before there, just beneath the figure's feet. A faint outline on the floor, as though the floorboards themselves had been burned, scorched by something long past. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. In the pitch blackness, Blake felt his body tense, his muscles locked in fear. The air was cold again, too cold, and something in the darkness was breathing. He could feel the weight of it, the presence. It wasn't just the spirit of Robert Harris, or the countless others said to haunt the mansion. No, this was something much older, something darker. As Blake's pulse thundered in his ears, he heard the sound again, the creaking of floorboards above. Then, another voice this time, a whisper so faint it almost felt like it was inside his own mind. "You shouldn't have come back." He spun around, his heart racing, but there was no one there, only the same oppressive darkness. And then the whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it was right next to him. "It's too late. You're already a part of it." Blake stumbled backward, his breath shallow, his mind frantically trying to make sense of what was happening. But he could no longer deny it. Something about this house was alive. Not just the spirits trapped within, but something ancient, something far more sinister than a mere haunting. He turned to look at Jason, still motionless on the floor. Blake reached out, trying to shake him awake, but as his fingers brushed Jason's shoulder, a coldness washed over him. The bodyguard's skin was pale, almost gray, his face frozen in a mask of sheer terror. Then, to Blake's horror, Jason's eyes flickered open, but not in the way a person's eyes should. They were glassy, lifeless, and when Jason's mouth opened, it wasn't his voice that came out. "Get out," it rasped, a voice like the crackling of dry leaves, the sound of a soul long lost to the house. "Before it claims you too." Blake's blood ran cold as he heard the unmistakable sound of someone moving behind him. He didn't dare turn around. He knew it would be too late. Then, without warning, the house seemed to explode with sound, the crashing of glass, the tearing of fabric, and the unmistakable sound of something being dragged across the floor. Blake felt a rush of air, cold and violent, like a gust of wind that came from nowhere. He turned, and saw it. At the end of the hall, the shadow had taken form, no longer a silhouette, but a tall, lanky figure in the tattered remains of an old suit, dragging something behind it. The thing was a body distorted, twisted, as though it had been disfigured by years of torment, but still alive. Blake's stomach churned, the horror crashing down on him. He turned and ran. He didn't care where he went. He didn't care if he had to jump out of the windows, he just needed to get out. But as he reached for the door, the same voice he'd heard earlier whispered from behind him. "You can't leave, you are the house now." Blake's hand froze just inches from the handle. The walls around him seemed to close in, the house shaking as if alive, and the shadowy figure moved closer, its footsteps echoing in his ears. It was too late. The house had him, and it would never let him go. Blake's heart hammered in his chest as his hand hovered over the doorknob. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body paralyzed by a terror he could not escape. The figure behind him, that twisted silhouette, was drawing nearer. Its footsteps echoed in the narrow hall, slow and deliberate, each step a death knell. "You can't leave, you are the house now," the voice whispered, its sound like the rustling of old papers or a distant, forgotten memory. Blake's mind screamed for him to move, but his body refused to obey. The walls seemed to pulse with a terrible energy, and the air grew thick, suffocating. The scent of decay, of something ancient and foul, filled his nostrils. He could feel the shadow's presence closing in, its cold breath crawling up his spine. He turned, and for the first time he saw it clearly. The figure was not human. It was an amalgamation of every ghost, every tormented soul that had ever been trapped within the mansion's walls. Its face was a grotesque mask, flickering with the images of the dead, each one distorted, tortured by years of torment. The eyes were hollow, empty voids, blacker than the night. Blake could not tear his gaze away. He felt as if it were pulling him in, drowning him in an ocean of fear. And then the figure spoke again. "You were warned, but now you are ours." The floor beneath Blake's feet groaned, as if it too were alive, and with a horrifying snap, the ground seemed to split open. The walls trembled, cracks spreading like veins across the house. The air grew colder, and he could hear whispers from every corner of the room. Thousands of voices, each one begging for release, begging for peace. He bolted for the door, his fingers finally finding purchase on the handle. He twisted it, nothing. The door wouldn't budge. His body surged with adrenaline, his mind filled with the primal need to survive. He screamed, his voice drowned out by the cacophony of whispers, the scratching of nails on the walls, the sound of something, or someone, moving behind him. "Let me out!" Blake cried, his hands pounding against the door. But his voice was lost in the overwhelming noise of the house, its creaks and groans, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls, the low growl of the shadow growing closer. Suddenly, there was a flash of movement. A blur of dark, skeletal hands shot out from the walls, grabbing him, pulling him toward the center of the room. He struggled, kicking, thrashing, but it was no use. The walls closed in, the floor buckled beneath his feet, and the house itself seemed to swallow him whole. Blake's screams were swallowed by the darkness. His body dragged into the depths of the mansion, where the shadows and the souls of the dead lingered, forever bound by the house's curse. The next morning, when the sun rose over the Hollywood Hills, the mansion stood silent. The windows gleamed in the sunlight, as if nothing had ever happened. But the house knew the truth. The house always knew, and it waited patiently for its next victim. Blake Harris was never seen again. His name faded from the headlines, lost to time, forgotten. But in the heart of the Hollywood Hills, the mansion still stands, a silent witness to the horrors within. The whispers still echo through the halls, the cold still lingers in the rooms, and somewhere in the depths of the house, Blake's soul is trapped, just like all the others before him. The mansion was sold again, as it always is. New owners, new tenants, all believing the house's beauty and grandeur would protect them. But the mansion doesn't care. It only wants one thing: to claim you, to keep you. And those who live within its walls soon realize there's no way out. Years passed, and the mansion in the Hollywood Hills changed hands once again. The once vibrant luxury property, now a symbol of something darker, continued to lure in those drawn to its splendor. They were unaware of the house's true nature, its insidious grip on the souls of anyone who dared to live there. It was just another piece of real estate, another mansion with a view. To the world, it was beautiful. To those who lived inside, it was a prison. One day, a couple young, ambitious, and unaware of the house's history moved in. Sarah and Daniel, both successful professionals, fell in love with the charm of the house. It was everything they dreamed of: sprawling, majestic, with a breathtaking view of Los Angeles. The air felt fresh, and the house, though old, seemed welcoming. It was exactly what they were looking for. But from the first night they spent there, strange things began to happen. At first, it was small, a creaking door in the middle of the night, objects slightly out of place. But as the days wore on, the unease grew. Sarah woke up to find her keys missing, only to find them hours later in a place she was certain she hadn't left them. Daniel, who worked late into the evenings, began hearing footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate, like someone was trailing him through the rooms. Then came the whispers, low at first, like the wind brushing against the walls. But soon they became clearer, more distinct. One evening, Sarah heard her name, soft at first, then louder. Sarah. She spun around, her heart racing, but there was no one there. That night, they decided to investigate. With a flashlight in hand, they explored the house, moving from room to room, each one colder than the last. As they entered the grand living room, Daniel froze, his eyes fixed on the far corner, the same place where Blake had seen the figure all those years ago. He saw it just for a moment. A tall, shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing motionless in the corner. "Did you see that?" Daniel whispered, his voice shaking. Sarah nodded, her throat dry, her chest tight. The whispers grew louder, now filling the entire house, as if the walls were breathing, alive with voices from the past. "You shouldn't be here," they hissed. "Leave before it's too late." The temperature dropped suddenly, a chill so intense it felt as if the house had swallowed the warmth of the air around them. Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs, and she felt an icy hand brush against her arm. She turned, but there was no one there. Panic set in. They bolted for the front door, but the moment they reached it, the handle snapped off in Daniel's hand. The door, once an exit to freedom, was now a barrier. The house had them. It always had, and it would never let them go. As the shadows closed in, they heard it again. The low, guttural growl that haunted those who entered. And then the whisper that had claimed so many before them. "You're ours now." The house, as it always did, claimed another two souls. Sarah and Daniel became a part of its endless, trapped history. Their voices added to the chorus of whispers that echoed through the halls. The mansion stood silently, waiting for the next pair of dreamers to come along, to be consumed by its insatiable hunger. And so the cycle continued. The mansion, forever cursed, would never be empty. It would always call, and those who listened, no matter how clever, no matter how cautious, would always find their way back to it. Because once you entered, the house had you, and it would never, ever let you leave. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.